And we are on episode 3 of our U.S. history textbook. And I have entitled this episode, Fight. This is all about the American Revolution. This is the definitive war that will give birth to what we now call the United States of America. So let's get started without further ado. So, who are our players in this episode? Well, first of all, here we have this gentleman right here, Thomas Paine, who we'll be speaking about later. No, it doesn't matter who you are. Just about everyone knows who this person is. You see him on your money every day, or at least your parents see him on their money every day. This is Benjamin Franklin. This gentleman here is King Philip, also known as Metacom. We'll be talking about him. This gentleman, of course, is Thomas Jefferson. And up here, I do not have a picture of a person, but rather I have a reference to an important group of people that we're going to be discussing, the true Sons of Liberty, and what their mission was all about as the Revolutionary War, the break with Great Britain unfolds. So let's take a little gander here, now that we know who our players are. Now let's look at the plot. There are a few things going on here. For one thing, before there's an American Revolution, we had the French and the British and American Indians, who are also referred to as Native Americans. I will probably refer to them as Native Americans throughout this video. That's just my personal preference. But anyway, there's something called the French and Indian War. And essentially what's going on is that the British and the French are fighting, and the Native Americans are kind of caught in the middle. So which side are they going to take? Now remember, we talked about in our last episode, we talked about the different approaches that the different European countries took in dealing with natives in the North American colonies. The Spanish and the British were particularly harsh with Native Americans, while the French, although certainly not perfect, took a more proactive approach in partnering with Native Americans to some extent, coming together with them, learning how to trade, learning how to fish, and then turn those things into industry. So the Native Americans were a little bit more sympathetic to the French than they certainly were to the British. And so what's going to happen, of course, a war is going to break out between France and Britain over who's going to control the North American colonies. You remember from world history, the French and the British are like those two brothers, one big brother and then the younger brother, and they're always fighting for who's the strongest in the same house. That's how the British and the French are with each other, and they bring that aspect of their relationship to the North American colonies. And it's going to break out in the French and Indian War. Ultimately, France is going to lose this war, despite the assistance of Native Americans. The thing for you to remember from the French and Indian War is the major impact. It's the Proclamation of 1763. This prevented the settlement of territory west of the Appalachian Mountains. Okay? That essentially prevents people or settlers from settling in that land past the Appalachian Mountains. But more importantly, it essentially kicks France out, and it pushes them up into parts of Canada. So this is why we have a lot of French-speaking parts in Canada to this day. Well, part of that is due, in fact, to the ramifications of the French and Indian War. So at this point, Great Britain has total control of the 13 colonies. Okay? Everything should be good for Britain. But we have a problem. Britain not only has been fighting the French and Indian War here in North America, but they've also had all of these other wars that they've been fighting overseas. And wars take money and people and time. Once those wars are settled, someone has to pay for all that debt. For the most part, the colonists had been left alone, or the patriots as we'll be calling them later. They'd pretty much been left to their own devices while Britain was off fighting this war and that war. So they pretty much learned how to sustain themselves. They governed themselves. They took care of their own needs. And there really wasn't that much interaction with Parliament, as far as they could see. But after the wars are over, Britain decides that this is the perfect time to tax the colonists. Why are they taxing the colonists? Because it's simple finance. They have to get the money from someplace. And the colonists are not pleased with that. And this is where this whole idea of salutary neglect comes from. That all this time, while Britain was fighting wars and essentially saying to themselves, we'll just leave those colonies alone. They're doing what they need to do. We have other things we have to take care of. But while they were doing that, the colonists were governing themselves. And that's a huge thing, because what they're showing is that they don't really need the British government. They don't need the crown to run their government. And that's going to be a big issue down the road. Especially when you couple it with our second bullet point here. We have these Enlightenment ideas. Now, I'm not going to go through the Enlightenment because you remember all of that stuff from world history. But those Enlightenment ideas, coupled with salutary neglect, are going to start to stoke the fires of revolution and these ideas of independence. The Patriots are not pleased with having to give up their money. And they're going to be willing to fight for it. So, what are some of these highlights in this chapter of the American Revolution? First, the Albany Plan of Union. Now, this technically has nothing to do with the American Revolution. This actually is connected to the French and Indian War. The colonies had to do something while Britain was fighting the French in North America. So their goal was, let's form one united government so that we can protect each other during the French and Indian War. A lot of the other colonies were essentially like, nah, we don't really want to do that, because the last thing we don't want, one government becoming too powerful. But it is important, and you'll see this on your region from time to time. The Albany Plan of Union is important because it served as a model for the U.S. government. This whole idea of different colonies or territories coming together to form one united body or government. Number 2, the French and Indian War, which we've already talked about. The French and Indian War did begin in 1754. Eventually, Britain is going to win that war. And France is essentially going to lose their presence in the North American colonies and will move primarily to Canada and continue to manage their other territories around the world. Remember, this is all before the French Revolution. All right? So, 1763, of course, this is also connected to the French and Indian War. We have the Treaty of Paris and the Proclamation of 1763, which I'm not going to go through. The big thing to remember that the Proclamation of 1763 essentially kicks France out of North America. And it prohibits colonists from settling west of the Appalachian Mountains. So Britain is in total control of the territory and the land. Now, this is supposed to reduce tensions with Native Americans. That just is not going to happen. And we'll see how that unfolds. But that's one of the aims of the Proclamation of 1763 and the rationale behind preventing people from settling west of the Appalachian Mountains. That was to reduce tensions with Native Americans. Okay. So, after salutary neglect and after Britain decides, hey, let's raise some taxes, there's going to be some pushback. And the first thing we hear is that it's a slogan that we all know. No taxation without representation. Now, I'm not going to yell it. Just imagine people wanting to hold on to their money and not being able to understand how they could be taxed even though they have no power to vote in Parliament. Remember, they were used to having a say in their government at the time that Britain was off fighting these other wars and not really being active in governing the colonies. That's salutary neglect. So the colonists, are essentially saying, listen, you guys were out minding your own business, and while you were doing what you were doing, we were taking care of our own business. So who are you to come back here and tell us that we have to pay you taxes when you don't even pay attention to us and you don't even take our votes? That's the mindset. Number 2, those taxes again. I'm going to stay on this tax thing. I'm not going to break down each and every tax. The big thing to remember is that the sugar, the stamp, and the tea acts These were among the many money-making laws the British government used to generate money to pay off their war debts. That's basically what it was. They were cash cows. And the colonists knew it, and they despised it. Okay, and yes, I did use a little alliteration there because I'm also an English teacher. This is what I do. So, listen, I am not going to explain each of these. They're fairly self-explanatory. What I want you to note, and I put the years there, is the escalation of events as we roll closer and closer towards the American Revolution. In 1770, we have the Boston Massacre. I want to put massacre in quote marks because it technically wasn't a massacre. I feel cheated as a child because I was taught as a child that it was a massacre and a lot of people died. It was a snowball fight. This is how the whole thing started. And according to the last research that I read and saw documented, no more than 5 to 10 people died in this massacre. But it is important because it does show that there are growing hostilities between the loyalists, those are the British, the redcoats, and the patriots, or the colonists, who are not in favor of all of these taxes. 1773, the Boston Tea Party. Again, in response to the Tea Acts, no one wants to pay taxes on the tea. Now here is the shady part of this. Colonists actually dressed as Native Americans. This is another topic where I feel that I was cheated as a child sitting in my social studies class because I was never taught this. The colonists actually dressed as Native Americans, and then they dumped the tea into the Boston Harbor in protest of the tea tax. Now, the irony is here, if they get caught, well, who gets blamed? The poor Native Americans are going to get blamed. So shady. But that's what they did. And the British government is upset. Tea is a big deal. It is a high-priced commodity. And to have dumped it in the Boston Harbor is a major economic hit. And the British are watching. And so, we have the Intolerable Acts of 1774. This was payback, essentially, for all the Boston Tea Party nonsense and drama that ensued. And so, Great Britain enacts all of these different laws restricting this and that. And the colonists, it's simply adding to the tension and the tumult that exists between the two parties. It's not going to get better because in 1776, January 1776, in fact, Thomas Paine, the first gentleman we looked at in our players slide, he's going to publish the Common Sense pamphlet, which we're going to be reading some of that in class at some point this week. This document is extremely important because Thomas Paine uses everyday language or the common vernacular of the Patriots to explain why the colonists had to break away from Britain and why they had to form a constitutional or democratic republic. Okay? That they could not continue to exist under a monarchy as tyrannical as King George. That it was not doing them any good, that they were not free. And he uses everyday language, and that's the main reason why it's so effective. When the Patriots hear that, they are galvanized, and they start to take up the cause, and the push for revolution gets louder and louder. And then finally, Declaration of Independence, 1776, July, of course, written primarily by Thomas Jefferson. This document is, I call it the official bye-bye letter from the Patriots to Great Britain. And essentially, Jefferson lays out a very clear thesis statement. King George, because he is a tyrannical leader who does not serve the needs of the people, who in fact oppresses his subjects, those subjects therefore have the right to overthrow that unjust government. And the Declaration of Independence is the official letter that we essentially hold up to the world and say, as of now, we are independent. That's not going to go over well with the number one power on the planet.